All right. Now that you probably had a little moment of break there, what we're going to be doing in the second part is, again, reviewing Piaget's ideas, but also introducing another major monumental figure in this area of cognitive development and some of his concepts that really stuck in this area when we look at kind of how people study this concept today. But first, I do want to talk a little bit more about Piaget because his ideas were really, really groundbreaking. So, first of all, just to review his concept, remember he talked about for the very first time this notion that children do not think like adults, that they have to actually learn how to interact with their environment, how to make sense of their environment before they can even come close to thinking like adults. And he argued that this process of change happens in very set stages, at very specific ages, and that these specific moments of learning are not things that can necessarily be accelerated. You just experience them when you experience them, and all of us will kind of get to the ends at the exact same time. Around 15 years of age is when we start to think like adults, is what Piaget stipulated. We've already seen in a couple different examples some of the criticisms that were raised about Piaget's theories. There's a couple other things that have also been raised since Piaget introduced this idea that we want to mention. One of the big issues, as we mentioned earlier, that people have kind of argued about Piaget is that even though his theories were groundbreaking, his measurements of timing might have been extremely inaccurate in a couple different areas. This quite possibly was because of the subjects he used. Remember, a lot of his research was originally done on his children, even though he did expand his participant pool as his research became more and more popular. But even then, a lot of people argued that Piaget just didn't give children credit for what they were capable of doing. The ability to understand conservation, which was something he thought happened at the very end of the pre-operational stage, is something that we see most kids are capable of doing at a much earlier age. Same thing with object permanence and a lot of the other levels of kind of basic thinking, especially early, I guess we call pre-operational and sensory motor functioning, seems to happen at a younger age than Piaget originally thought. And there are, as we see, individual differences that also need to be taken into account. And you can see that in the picture depicted to the right. Kids at age 9 can sometimes already be thinking at what he would call mature concrete operational stage, even though that wasn't something that he kind of proposed would happen to some children. And in fact, there's even some kids at age 6 that can think at a mature concrete operational stage when there was no notion that could happen in Piaget's early work. Another complaint that people have raised is the fact that Piaget, again, assumed that we thought like adults by the time we reached age 15. And there's substantial research to show that many people, even in their late adulthood years, do not contain or do not possess the abstract thinking capabilities that he thought all of us had. And again, this might have been simply because of the people that he studied or the groups that he was interested in, or just some of the basic assumptions that he held firm to without actually having research to back it up. So even though his ideas, again, were very, very groundbreaking, beautiful in their complexity, but also simplicity, there were some shortcomings to his ideas. And one of the more recent arguments that people have started to raise with this particular concept is that it doesn't really take into account the context or the culture that the person's coming from when we look at cognitive development. Now, we have to acknowledge that Piaget at his time would never have been capable of thinking about this. Culture was not something that people considered. They never even thought that people might process things differently depending upon the region they grew up in or the experiences that they've had. But as cultural psychology has grown, what we've started to realize is that based on training, based on exposures, children of different cultures do process things slightly differently and, more importantly, accelerate through specific stages faster and sometimes slower based on the environment that they are raised in, based on some of the things that they encounter along the way. And when we combine all of these things, what we see is there's a gaping hole in this theory of cognitive development that we still need to fill with other information. And one of the big people to kind of add to this idea of cognitive development, one that really, really allowed researchers to understand the complexity of cognitive development at a much higher level than we had with just Piaget's theory, was a man named Lev Vygotsky, who coincidentally published his ideas on cognitive development at almost the exact same time that Jean Piaget developed his ideas and presented them. Fortunately, most people, before taking a class on developmental psychology, have almost never heard of Lev Vygotsky, even though many people in developmental psychology think his idea, his contributions to the concept of cognitive development, were almost equally important as the ideas of Jean Piaget's were. And it's partially due to the fact that he was not necessarily the most vocal person, so he didn't really promote his ideas like Piaget did, but also it might have something to do with the culture and the time. Vygotsky, as you might guess based on that name and that very serious picture, was Russian, and he did not necessarily find himself in everybody's good graces because of that in the early 19th century when he was trying to push this idea. He also didn't have an exceptionally long lifespan, which might have also had an impact on the ability to really promote his game-changing ideas on cognitive development. And what were these ideas? Well, they were in line with Piaget for the most part. He argued that just like Piaget, he thought that children did not think like adults, and they had to process things in numerous ways before they could start to develop the cognitive skills that adults had. He also argued that this process probably did happen in a fairly consistent manner. Everybody went through challenge 1, then challenge 2, then challenge 3 as they progressed throughout their entire lifespan. But he argued, which was very different from Piaget, that this unfolding pattern, this growth, was not necessarily set. That you didn't have to wait till age 2 for you to start developing skills to process other ideas. Instead, he argued that we could theoretically accelerate person through a specific stage of cognitive development if we created the right scenario, the right environment for a child or a young adult. And this idea of cognitive growth and development was embedded within two of his very, very powerful concepts that he introduced to the field of developmental psychology, called zones of proximal development and scaffolding. Now, he argued that a zone of proximal development was an area where a child could learn something not necessarily on his or her own, but with the assistance of another. So there was this area where a child would just have no ability to learn a concept or a schema with or without assistance. There was a moment where a child had developed to an age where they could easily process a schema, develop an understanding of something, even without assistance. But he said there was a sweet spot called the zone of proximal development, where if given the right teaching, in particular, a type of teaching he called scaffolding, where the teacher, this could be an adult, this could be another child, taught the child about the schema at a level slightly above their current level, the child could actually accelerate through that process. It could learn the schema quicker, the cognitive concepts quicker, and in doing so, really accelerate the developmental process in total, because they could get to a new zone of proximal development a little bit earlier for a new schema, and eventually, the child could essentially accelerate through all the cognitive development at a much younger age than what Piaget had originally proposed. And he stressed in this idea of scaffolding that communication, a specific type of dialogue was really important, and a lot of his research was based on this notion of when zones of proximal development occurred, how you could test them, and what the proper scaffolding technique could actually look like. Well, in addition to introducing this idea of zones of proximal development and scaffolding, another big contribution that Vygotsky made to the field of cognitive development was this notion that communication was absolutely essential in cognitive development. Piaget kind of assumed that kids could learn things on their own, that they didn't necessarily need a lot of interaction to achieve these things. But Vygotsky argued that for a child to truly process a schema, some type of communication, either within the child's head or within the environment, needed to unfold for these processes to really settle into a child's head. And he argued that, when we look at this developmental process, we can actually see it working in the environment, especially with young kids, because he argued this type of communication happened in two forms. One, which a child did not have available to them until a much later age. So Vygotsky argued that some children to develop basic things like the idea of object permanence or a sense of self, develop these things through what was called public speech. So you can teach a child how to develop a sense of self, or how object permanence works, and the child can acknowledge how object permanence works by kind of replicating or mimicking those statements through public speech. And he argued in early years of development, this was the only way that children could actually develop the cognitive understanding that they developed. But he said at about 3 to 7 years of age, something really interesting happens. A child transitions from having thoughts that are always expressed publicly, verbally, to having thoughts that can actually start happening in their own head. The child realizes that they can say something and actually have something else, some voice going on inside their head that isn't saying the same thing. And it's depicted in the cartoon you see over there to the right. And he argued that this is a slow process that kids actually have to learn. And you can see this in their behavior. So he said if you look at a kid struggling with a cognitive concept, like, say, conservation, something that Piaget studied, when you first try to explain conservation to a child, they only can kind of operate on what they see in the surface. If you ask a child to explain how conservation works, they'll articulate things verbally, they'll process their thinking in a way that you can actually hear. But as the child gets to about 4 years of age, something really neat happens. They start to mouth words without actually saying them. And he argued this is really the first moments where inner speech start to be realized by these kids. And about 5, 6, maybe even 7 years of age, depending on the child will eventually develop this recognition that they don't even need to mouth the words. They can just think the words in their head, and they can have a dialogue with themselves. And he argued that this dialogue internally that happens later on is really, really powerful. It allows us to do things like metacognition, which we talked about a little bit earlier in this class, thinking about your thinking about your thoughts. We'll get into much more detail about that a little bit later. But in addition to that, it also increases social skills because, having this inner speech, having this inner dialogue allows you to kind of consider different options or kind of pursue something that might be kind of more socially acceptable than saying what's really on your mind. And it might even be something that could improve your problem solving skills, not only with conservation, but much more difficult tasks. And in fact, there was research that showed, even though Vygotsky wasn't able to do it in his own research, that this inner voice can indeed dramatically improve a child's problem solving skills. But this notion of language really being at the heart of cognitive development was something that we have to attribute to Vygotsky, and something that many developmental psychologists believe is not necessarily as impactful as the stages of development, but very, very critical in our understanding of how cognitive development works. Now, one of the major areas where Vygotsky was very, very powerful, or at least very influential, was in the area of education. Now, many people don't necessarily think of Vygotsky when they think of educational practices, but a lot of his tools and techniques that he introduced have found their way into the classroom setting. But in addition to this, a lot of Piaget's ideas and concepts about stages being set, about things needing to be learned in a specific order, have also found their way into our classroom setting. What I thought we could do, just to kind of understand exactly how important these two figures are, how influential their theories are to this idea of development and even our everyday lives, is have you sit for just a second or two and think about how Piaget's ideas and Vygotsky's ideas could be applied to a school system to make them more effective. In fact, you're going to have in your activity for this week a requirement to kind of write about this. So if you can, for the next few minutes, just think about how Piaget's ideas and how Vygotsky's ideas could really shape the educational environment, or also might have actually shaped our educational environment. This might require a little bit extra thinking, but please do this. Take a few minutes, pause. And when you're done with that, you can move on to our last big topic of Piaget's that we're going to talk about in this class, and that's kind of later cognitive development that he kind of argued happened in our later adulthood years. And this was at the very end of his research and his theories that were out there. But first, again, why and how have Piaget's and Vygotsky's theories impacted cognitive or understanding of the schooling system?
Alright, now that you guys have thought about that, and hopefully you stopped for a few minutes, we're going to move on to the last idea of cognitive development, and that's this notion that not only do we develop as young kids, but we also develop in adulthood. Our cognitive ideas, our adult cognitions, are also changing in adulthood. And this concept of changes is actually something that was proposed by Piaget very late in his life. But he didn't really specify exactly what this particular stage of development was. He called it something called post-formal thought, and other researchers have kind of called it post-formal thought. But we don't know what post-formal thought or post-formal thinking actually entailed. However, since studying this concept of post-formal thoughts or growth in cognition in adulthood, there's three things that have come out as possible ways that we become more complex as we age. One of the things that's come out is this concept of something called pragmatic thinking, where we can apply past knowledge to new situations. So knowing what's happened in the past can allow us to kind of avoid some pitfalls that we might encounter in the present. So if you try to take, say, a square peg and put it in a circular hole, you only have to do it so many times before you realize that that's kind of a futile behavior, and that's growth in pragmatic thinking. And as we age in adulthood, we become more and more adept at this pragmatic thinking, that we don't have to continually bang our heads against a wall when we're running into something that's not working. We can adjust our behavior before we even commit it, so we can kind of, make life more easier on us and get through things in a much quicker way. Another thing that we run into is kind of growth in something called dualistic or reflective thinking. That there's not just right or wrong, everything isn't just bad or good. It falls somewhere in a line of spectrum. So somebody might not be somebody that we really like, but they're not pure evil. Or they're not unbelievably great individuals if we do like them. Most people have their faults. Most people have their good qualities, and we can kind of recognize in theory the differing degrees of qualities and faults that people have. We can also see this in different ideas and concepts. So, if you've got a football team that you really like and they're having a horrible season, you might think that really makes you sad, but you can also think that that provides you with the opportunity to be less stressed out, and it gives you more things to do on your Saturdays or Sundays because they're not doing that well. That type of thinking is really indicative of this dualistic reflective thinking, and there's a belief that this is something that we're kind of gaining the ability to do as we age. Another thing we gain the ability to do, and the last big thing that we kind of stipulate we gain the ability to do in this post-formal thought process, is something called relativistic thinking, or relativist thinking, where we not only can see our perspective, but we can actually start to understand other people's perspectives in situations and conflicts. So we might have an argument with our roommates, and then at the age of 15, 16, even up to 20, we might not even have an opportunity to understand other people's thoughts and the way other people are seeing things. But after exposure to enough people's thoughts and after growth within this cognitive area, we might actually understand why we have this conflict with our roommate, why they actually have their beliefs and why we have our beliefs. Now, that might not make us change our ideas of things, but at least we have the ability to see things from other people's perspectives. And just like this formal thought process, a lot of researchers within cognitive psychology believe that there's some people that go through post-formal thought development, but there's also a large number of people that never really master these processes. So not only can they not do basic logic, but they certainly can't do anything like pragmatic or relativistic thinking. In fact, there's considerable evidence to show that only a few people actually develop through this post-formal thought stage, that they're able to understand other people's perspectives continuously, that they're able to understand the concept of gray zones and that everything's not horrible or great, and that they can apply past things that they've learned to make things easier in the future. But if we do this, we've developed, in theory, through that final stage of development, that cognitive development.
All right, this marks the end of this lecture. In our next class, we're going to be actually going into much greater detail of specific cognitive concepts. So we've talked about two of the biggest influential figures. Now we're going to look at some of the terms and areas that they were interested in, things like processing, memory, attention, thinking, and that big cute term called metacognition that people like. So please make sure you get those write-ups in, make sure you're working, and be prepared for our next class when we get into some more terms, more concepts that relate to what we covered in this class. Take care all.